This show is very late today, but only because I decided to prioritize the written publication of stuff over this morning's show, and it's because there were a lot of opinions that had come in that I needed to publish. I didn't want them to get backed up because I mean, sometimes I publish these opinions like a week late, or sometimes even more than a week late. And then there was the news story about what Vince Borja he was able to convince the Secretary of the Navy to direct assistance from the military on Guam to help out with Southern High School. And uh, if I had waited to do those written things after, oh, and then that video came in. Sorry, that video came in from the Agata students. If I had waited to do it after the morning show, see, these things take a lot of energy out of me. Not the written stuff. These shows, like talking, takes a lot of energy out of me. And so, yeah, that's why I pushed everything around today. So I'm sorry that I'm late. It's now 11:40 a.m. It's still the morning on Tuesday, August 18, 2026. My name is Troy Torres. Welcome to the morning show here on Kandit News. This is the Tuesday news analysis, and today our two subjects, one that I'm going to divide into two parts. And the first is regarding Simon Sanchez High School rebuild. The first part of that being the cancellation of the current RFP and how that moves things along, but also, I was going to say bizarre, but par for the course, the administration is blaming somebody else and not taking responsibility for its own actions. The second part would be about the Ma Kahat Act itself and how the legislature can do everyone a pretty quick solid by fixing that fatally flawed legislation by Roy Kenyatta. I'll explain to you why it's such a stupid piece of authorization and how that Ma Kahat Act was never going to work in the best interest of the taxpayers or the students. And then the last thing is the administration, despite despite evidence of several agencies being used as political dumping grounds by LTAs, limited term appointments in several agencies. They have the gall, the Guam Visitors Bureau, of all agencies, one of the most failed within the government of Guam, is begging the legislature for the authority to appoint more LTAs. We'll talk about these three things, and we'll actually try to get senators who are involved with these things on the air. There'll be cold calls. I didn't warn anyone prior to, and it's because I just didn't have any time. But if they're available, hopefully they'll talk, and it's not like we're going to have a contentious discussion with them. But I do want to ask about changes that would need to be made to the Ma Kahat Act, in my opinion, and also this issue with the LTAs. And we'll start with that whole cancellation of the RFP on the other side of this commercial break. Stick with us.
Good Morning Show with Troy Torres is brought to you by 76 Circle K Guam.
Late yesterday, after, I don't know, it's almost been a year. Almost been a year since the Simon Sanchez High School rebuild fell into limbo when in mid-November or late November of 2025, the second ranked offerer in the procurement that began in March of 2025 protested or launched the first of three protests in the procurement. Protest yielded an automatic stay. DPW tried to have the governor tried to have the automatic stay lifted. The governor and the lieutenant governor tried to force the entire thing through. Then public knowledge of what happened during the negotiations, and more importantly, how much this was going to cost us, came to light, and everything came to a screeching halt. And finally, we have some sort of progress in that Department of Public Works, which was supposed to have answered the protests in a timely fashion, the first one being lodged in November and the next two being lodged in mid-December, DPW having never answered those protests, meaning DPW is the agency solely responsible for the delay. They have finally answered the 3 protests. I'm going to talk about one of them. The first 2, I don't feel comfortable talking about yet because I don't fully understand DPW's point. But the third one I do understand, and it's probably the most important of them. But the lead or the headline here is that DPW canceled the RFP, canceled the procurement, meaning they're going to go back to the drawing board and this thing's going to restart. And they did it, and they give the reason, right? And the reason is this thing is going to be stalled in protest hell or in procurement hell if we don't restart this thing. So based on the authorization by law, we are restarting this thing. And frankly, that might be the best decision that they can make at this time. However, like the big caveat there is, why didn't they just answer the protests back in November and December, or at least in January, or how about in February? It took all of this time for DPW to answer the protests. So GPS, the second ranked offerer, they filed 3 protests. The first was about a lack of or an incomplete procurement record. I can't remember what the second one was, but the third one was about price. And this is the one I feel a little more qualified to talk about. So on top of DPW blaming the protester for the delays, which is, you can blame the protester for lodging the protest, which would explain the original delay. And when I say you can blame, I'm saying that without context. Like, the reason that we have these protest mechanisms in procurement law is to prevent corruption and cronyism. And so what if there was that? So anyway, I'm not saying that there was, but what if there was that? So you can't blame a contractor for exercising mechanisms in the law that are meant to protect the public, that like we're supposed to be protected. The government of Guam should not be complaining that a company is exercising their right to be protected and to protect public funds. So anyway, one of the last thing that GPS protested, because when they saw the price that Cortec, the first ranked offerer, had offered the construction cost of Simon Sanchez High School at 166 point something million dollars. It was the cap. The Ma Kahat Act set a cap on how much the construction cost would be. And in the second half of the show, I'm going to talk about how that cap is stupid. So, but it's in the laws. It's part, you have to follow the law, right? So they set $166 million cap for construction costs. They also set a $16.3 million annual during the leaseback period cap on debt service payments to the developer. Just keep this in mind. This is the most important part of the entire thing, is the $16.3 million, not the 166, but the law being what it was. Construction costs were capped at 166. So in Cortec's bid, or in their offer, on the first page, they named the price as 166 point whatever million dollars, right? But there's something called a term sheet, which is a few pages afterward. And in the term sheet, it shows the price breakdown. And so Cortec does this price breakdown, right? And they say, we get this, 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 and this. And based on the design, there are all these other things. And they're going to cost $30 million more. And so the bottom line is $190-some million. And this is without the demolition costs included in the total $198 million. Because there's a current facility at Simon Sanchez High School. They need to demolish that properly and then build the new facility from there. And they have 18 to 24 months. I think it's 24 months from the date of they received the lease to the property to construct the facility. And after the 24 months, they turn it over. They lease it back. That's why it's called a lease back. They lease it back to the government of Guam. And in a 30-year period, the government of Guam pays an annual debt service to the contractor. So on Cortec's term sheet, it said 166 whatever plus $30 million in what's called value-added engineering. But the thing is that value-added engineering went to design, like you were supposed to have those things in there. So it was supposed to have been in the 166. It was considered to be an option. That's what the value-added engineering was. The problem is the RFP specifically said that offerers, when they were making their price, they were constructing their price, could not provide the government with options because it's harder to rank things when you do something like that. So the Cortec provided an option. The RFP said you can't provide options, otherwise the offer becomes non-responsive to the procurement, to the RFP. And that was the contention that GPS had. Nowhere in DPW's reply to that protest, protest number 3, did DPW ever acknowledge that that portion of the RFP exists, the portion about the options. It's like its own part of the RFP. And so DPW dismisses that protest based on that, which is a moot point because they dismissed the entire procurement. But still, this is a matter of the record now. And DPW, like if I'm pretty sure GPS would respond to at least protest number 3 and been like, look, why did you have this in the RFP if this was not something that you were going to follow? And you said that if you provide options, you're non-responsive. Anyway, so that whole thing is now dead in the water. But I suppose now this is going to be like crying over, or not crying over spilled milk, but I'm really bad with sayings. Water under the bridge, is that what it is? Anyway, so let me just explain what I'm saying, and then you can figure out the saying that I'm trying to get at. DPW, in their answering of the protest, they lay all the blame on the protester, and they take no responsibility or accountability whatsoever for their part in the delay, which was the most significant part of the delay. And it's because once the protests were filed, DPW was supposed to have timely responded to the protests. And with that timely response to the protest comes the next step in the process. The protester could appeal DPW's decision. They could leave it alone, and then the procurement will go through, or they could appeal DPW's decision, and then that appeal would be handled by the Office of Public Accountability. And then the OPA can rule on that appeal. And if the protester is satisfied with the appeal ruling, then the procurement can go through. As so long as the OPA doesn't determine that this entire thing was wrong and it needs to be whatever. But if the protester is not satisfied with OPA's ruling, the protester can then take the matter to the Superior Court, and then there's a drawn-out litigation, right? And hopefully, you would hope that the court resolves the matters timely in the interests of the territory. And so DPW never allowed the process to get past the protests because DPW never answered the protests until yesterday. So when Vince Ariola, the director of the agency, says that the project is a long-delayed critical public infrastructure project affecting thousands of students, teachers, blah, 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 blah. When he says delay would not serve the public interest and would undermine the legislature's intent that this project proceeds without unnecessary obstruction. When he says GPS has made it clear that it seeks to disqualify Cortec and to be awarded the contract at stake. This indicates to DPW that this matter will likely be subject to litigation and thus indefinite delay. When he says DPW finds it necessary to cancel the existing RFP in order to address numerous requirements in the Ma Kahat Act that restrict the government from formulating the best contract terms for the best facility that will meet the current and future needs of the SSHS student body in a more cost-effective manner. When he says, unless the RFP is canceled, the government must suffer from failing to account for issues that have arisen due to the age of the Ma Kahat Act and the considerations which have become obsolete yet still impact the existing design for the facility. When he says, because the government's negotiations have become public and due to the cloud over this procurement created by these protests, any award of attempt to move this procurement forward will result in litigation, which will only further delay construction of SSHS. He blames everybody else but himself and his agency for failing to respond to the protests. And this entire time that the administration has been telling us about these delays, and it's everybody else's fault. They failed to inform the public that the entire thing has been stuck with the administration, with DPW, since November of last year. So finally, they take a step that seems to be rational to cancel the procurement, and hopefully this has not exposed the government of Guam to any type of liability that will land this in court and that will delay this any further. And hopefully the legislature, if they're listening, if they're paying attention to this very important issue, goes over the Ma Kahat Act, makes the changes necessary to make that stupid law something that is actually going to provide greatest value for the taxpayers of the island, and a quick resolution to a problem that has persisted since the government made this promise in 2013 to the Simon Sanchez High School community, and make the changes to that law to make things viable. And we'll talk about that on the other side of the commercial break, and hopefully get Senator Chris Duenas, who is most versed in the financial matters of the government within the legislature, on the line with us to talk about the Ma Kahat Act and possible changes. Stick with us. No, I want Domino's pizza. Senator Chris Duenas is in a meeting right now. He said he'll call later. Let me just give me a second to message him. Would like to get your live show thoughts on the Ma Kahat Act. Okay. So this whole authorization to build Simon Sanchez High School, first of all, it started back in 2013 with something called the Ma Kahat Act of 2013. That was an absolute failure. That was, by the way, Judy Wonpat's law. It was an absolute failure. It and one of the companies that's actually involved in the current messed up thing was the protester of the original RFP or IFB back in the day in 2013. Anyway, fast forward 10 years, and the legislature is like, okay, we don't want to repeat the mistakes of 2013, and we want to make this as smooth as possible. So they passed the Ma Kahat Act of 2023, which is the authorization for to build Simon Sanchez High School. And what's that saying? We're like too many chefs in the kitchen or something. I think that's what might have been what happened. Either that or some unseemly characters got a hold of influencing the language in that bill for one reason or another, and were able to insert language in that bill that didn't make any sense. So there are three main things, three very key parts of the authorization to build Simon Sanchez High School. The first and most important, and actually the only one that should matter, is the legislature authorizing, and it's a little bizarre how the language is here. They said that during the leaseback period, every year the government of Guam is authorized to expend up to $16.3 million. I'll explain that in a second. The second thing it authorizes that's significant here is that whatever bond is taken out, the maximum interest rate that the bond can be pledged at is 8.5%. That's pretty high, actually, but it gives a lot of wiggle room, right? Also, the first unnecessary component to this bill. But the third one is the one that works against the people and the taxpayers of Guam and only works to the benefit of the contractor. And that is a cap on construction costs. And the cap on construction costs that the legislature set back in 2023 was $167 million. Absolutely unnecessary. Matter of fact, hurts the entire thing. Because here's the thing. Why do the taxpayers care what the cost of construction is, right? Why do they care if it costs the developer $10 million or $500 million to build Simon Sanchez High School, when not a single one of those dollars is coming from the taxpayers? That's the cost of construction. That's for the developer to pay. The only thing that the people of Guam need to be concerned about is what we're actually going to pay, what the legislature actually authorizes the Treasury to pay to the developer. And that's the annual payment of $16.3 million at the cap. But when you multiply $16.3 million times 30, you get $489 million. And when you add $32 million more for the first 2 years of the development of the leaseback period, which is considered the lease period, it goes to more than $500 million. That's the only thing that the taxpayers, that's you and me, that the public treasury should be concerned about, is that amount of money. And what is it that we're getting for that amount of money? Why the legislature placed those three things into this one authorization, hamstringing everything and making everything that much more confusing, is beyond me. Because when you listen to the negotiations that occurred between Cortec and the government of Guam in the summer of last year, let's set aside the bad thing that Ho Yun said, right, about making a donation to the senators in order to get whatever. Set that aside for a second. And understand that the majority of this entire thing was Cortec and DPW, GIDA, and all these agencies that were on the negotiating table trying to fit everything into the construction costs. And nobody at the table questioning the amount of money that the taxpayers were going to pay and what it was that we were going to get out of that amount of money. Like there was nothing that happened about that. Like there was no discussion about the good of the taxpayers and the value that the Simon Sanchez High School community was going to get. Everything was centered around the construction cost. Why do we care what the construction cost is? That's not something that we're paying. That's what the developer is going to pay. Matter of fact, if the developer wants to give us $500 million if the developer wants to spend $500 million to build all these great things for Simon Sanchez High School, but probably would it be a better thing to spread that around to other schools as well? Then, that's better than if the developer gave us a $10 million product, because at the end of the day, we're still paying the same amount of money every single year. And at the end of the 30 to 32 years, it's going to be the same amount of money, interest, and principal. And so here's what the legislature really needs to do with the Ma Kahat Act. They need to go in there. They need to get rid of the construction cost cap. They need to get rid of that whole interest rate cap. They need to leave the entire financing to the developer. They need to pledge. We probably need to increase the amount by now. And let me give you a pretty good reason why. Maybe increase the annual pledge to $20 million and make it very clear that this is not just for the leaseback period. We're also going to pay this for the lease period so that we don't have to worry about capitalized interest. And so whatever it is that the developer is going to do on the markets, however the developer is going to sell this, and we should probably, because of how the financial situation in the world is right now, not limit ourselves to the New York market, but expand to the British market or to the South Korean market or to the Japan market, to be able to allow the developer to secure financing through any of those avenues, through any of those markets, right? Let them figure it out. We're just responsible for the annual payment, and in return, we're going to get something. So what whatever this procurement is, it should be, hey, if we paid you $20 million a year for 32 years, tell us what you're able to build for us. Number one being Simon Sanchez High School. And hey, by the way, sky's the limit on what else you're able to offer us. And the developer that makes the best offer, that gives us the best value for that $20 million a year, is the one who wins in a very objective type of way. For example, if developer one says, we'll build you Simon Sanchez High School, and it's going to look like Ukudu High School, it's going to look like JFK, whatever. We don't need the Cadillac design. And also, we need to scrap the original design, by the way, because that's the Cadillac design. That's what's going to make things very expensive. So we'll build you Simon Sanchez High School. And we're also going to, for $20 million a year, as part of this package, modernize George Washington High School, and we're going to build you Tumuning Middle School. Or developer number two says, yeah, so we're going to build you Simon Sanchez High School. We're also going to rebuild Agata Johnson Middle School, and we're going to rebuild Inarahan Middle School. And developer number three says, we're going to build you Simon Sanchez High School, and we're going to build you 3 middle schools wherever you want us to place it. And it's going to be this, this, and this. Then an evaluation committee can come together and say, the best thing the best value here and where we're going to get the best bang for our buck is developer B or developer C, whoever. So that at the end of the day, we know that our money is being invested into something that is valuable, that is of value to us taxpayers, but most importantly, to the public schools. Because it just, to me, ain't going to fly that you're going to spend $16.3 million a year for 32 years, or more than $500 million for just one school. That doesn't make any sense to me. And so the legislature having hamstrung, someone needs to ask Roy Kanata, like, what were you thinking? This is former Senator Roy Kanata's bill. And it's like, what are you thinking? What were you thinking when you included those 3 things? Please explain the logic in it, because it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. I don't think we're going to be able to get Senator Duenas or Senator Borja on the line, because they're in, according to them, they're in meetings. So we'll just go to commercial break. And on the other side of that, I want to talk about GVB begging for the legislature to give them the authority to hire more limited term appointments, more limited term employees. Basically, just hire whoever they want to do whatever they want into an agency that has been an absolute failure at its job. Well, stick with us. We'll talk about that on the other side of the commercial break.
You asked, we delivered. Guam Auto Spot is extending our overstock sell-off with the hottest deals on island, like our 2025 GMC Canyon with $4,000 off. Or slide into a brand new Mitsubishi Eclipse Cross, starting at just $24,995. September is your chance to drive big and save even bigger. Visit us today or get pre-approved online at guamautospot.com or call 478-AUTO. Guam Auto Spot, where the savings never stop.
This stuff's hitting the spot. One of the things I've been busting my butt on this week has been research and bringing to you the results of that research about agencies being used as political dumping grounds, and it's been amazing. When you see these stories, you're going to be like, "What the hell?" There was a time just 8 years ago, and for the entirety of the Camacho and Calvo administrations, that it was very tough. You were in a very tough political environment to justify the hiring of unclassified employees, and it was much harder to justify the hiring of limited term employees and things called special projects coordinators. And that's because these were made to be bad terms following the Gutierrez administration and the findings by the media back then about all of the agencies that were used as political dumping grounds in order to, it was the cronyism, right? Like, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine. Unfortunately, the politicians were using public funds in order to do the scratching of the backs, right? By hiring people who were not needed and people who weren't even qualified for certain things. So they were placed into these appointments. They were able to receive the qualifications that they needed by being placed into, at least on paper, by being placed into these positions. And then they would be classified later, right? Either because of attrition or because they would open up new positions, and on paper, because they had these experiences, they would be able to qualify. And it made the most sense in practice to hire these people. That's why in the government of Guam, you will notice that there appear to be a bunch of people who are not qualified whatsoever to be in those positions. Or you wonder, like, couldn't they have chosen somebody better? And the answer is yes, they could have, but because of this practice that pervaded through the Gutierrez administration, it was all but shut down in the Camacho administration, continued to be a bad practice or something that was frowned upon in the Calvo administration. And then it just crept back up in the Leon Guerrero administration. And nobody was really paying attention to it because, number one, the size of the newsrooms throughout the island have severely dwindled, right? Because of market forces and all that. But also there was a pandemic. And so it was not the easiest thing in the world to track these things and to prioritize the type of reporting into hiring, travel, all the different stuff that we were used to for years and years and years. We're almost at the 8-year mark. So I was like, let's look into this. And the election's over, for at least for the administration. So I was like, okay, it's time to look into this, right? Jesus, the amount of LTAs and special projects coordinators and unclassified appointments that this administration has engaged in since, you guessed it, 2022, the re-election year, with a little bit of calming down that happens 2023, 2024, and then it just bounces back up in 2025 and 2026 at several different agencies being used as political dumping grounds. One of the ones suspected of being that, Guam Visitors Bureau. And in a recent letter, an August 15 letter from Regine Bisco Lee, who's the CEO of GVB, to Jesse Lujan, who is the oversight chairman. This was prior to the legislature passing the budget. So the governor submitted a budget that allowed GVB to keep hiring LTAs, limited term appointments. And the legislature took it out. The legislature was like, no, we're not going to do that. And so Regine Lee is like, we need these people. We need to be able to hire these people. And therefore, landscaping, tree trimming, right-of-way maintenance, pressure washing, trash collection, beach cleaning and raking, hazard mitigation, maintenance of signage and visitor infrastructure. They're needed for the maintenance of island-wide visitor sites. They're needed for public art and cultural preservation. They're needed for typhoon and disaster response. My question is, why don't you have classified employees doing this? Or, like, why don't you hire the right way? Or why don't you outsource this type of stuff? And so that warrants a response from Jesse Lujan, who on August 17, which was yesterday, wrote to Regine Lee and copied, and also George Chu, the chairman of the board, Joaquin Cook, the vice chairman. He says, I'm writing a response to GVB's recent memorandum regarding what it characterizes as a need to restore authority for GVB to employ limited term appointees. After reviewing both the FY26 budget law and the FY27 budget bill presently under consideration, I'm requesting clarification as to precisely what authority GVB believes has been removed. Section 26 of the budget provides that unless otherwise authorized, government funds may not be expended for the employment or hiring of unclassified employees in the executive branch, except for specifically enumerated positions and circumstances. The FY27 budget contains substantially the same language in Section 27, including the same general restriction and substantially the same categories of authorized exceptions. Based on our review, GVB is not identified as having a general exemption from this restriction in either the 26 law or the 27 bill. The enumerated exceptions continue through specific agencies, positions, and circumstances, but neither provision appears to provide GVB with a general authority to hire limited term or other unclassified employees. Both budgets do not contain or do contain a separate limited term appointment provision. However, that provision is narrowly tailored to vacancies resulting from the extended absence of a classified employee because of active military service or a certified long-term disability. The FY26 law permits such an appointment only for the period corresponding to the employee's qualifying absence. The FY27 bill contains substantially the same authority. Accordingly, there appears to be no substantive change between the two budget provisions. This raises an important question. Please identify the specific statutory, regulatory, personnel rule, or budgetary authority that GVB relied upon to hire and compensate its existing limited term appointees. Because what you're going to see in a story from Kandit is that, boy, has GVB packed its ranks with political appointees. And when you consider the amount of employees and money that this agency has spent in public funds, against the fact that and their employment roles have increased, while at the same time the one thing that they exist to do, and that is to get tourists over here, they've absolutely failed at doing. It's like, what planet are these guys living on, and how could they have the audacity to even ask to have this done, when you especially consider all of the other agencies that have done this, that have been used as political dumping grounds? I'll call it out for exactly what it is. They are political dumping grounds. That's the only reason that you have all of these unclassified, limited term, detailed appointments, and special projects coordinators. Continuing, if GVB believes that authority exists independently of the provisions discussed above, please provide the specific citation. I also want to address the timing of this request. GVB has significant institutional and legislative experience available to it, including a former senator, 2 former senior legislative employees, as well as legal counsel. The FY27 budget has been publicly available and under active legislative review since February 2nd of this year, when the governor transmitted her budget to the legislature, 194 days before your August 15 memorandum. If GVB believed that language in the proposed budget would materially affect its personnel authority, there was ample opportunity to raise that concern while amendments were being considered. It would have been prudent to identify any potential issues during that process rather than after the amendment period had concluded. The legislature has substantial work before it, particularly as we address the financial and operational challenges facing Guam's tourism industry. We need our agencies to carefully review legislation affecting their operations, raise concerns in a timely manner, and provide clear legal support when requesting changes to public law. We cannot afford to have anyone asleep at the wheel. I therefore respectfully request that GVB provide the legal authority supporting its current LTA appointments, along with an explanation of the specific differences between FY26 law and the FY27 proposal that GVB believes necessitates legislative action. Regine Lee wrote back. It's a long letter. So can I just wrap up her long letter? No, that's just. The LTA positions currently supporting destination development have been funded through federal resources, which have allowed a GVB to maintain these positions during the current fiscal year. She never answered how it was authorized, because there's an active and current restriction. She says, in referring to the need to restore LTA authority, our intent was not to suggest that the FY27 budget affirmatively repeals a GVB-specific statutory exemption contained in the FY26 budget. We could have used different verbiage. Our intent was to request clear legislative authority for GVB to continue employing LTA personnel consistent with the Bureau's personnel rules and regulations, operational needs, and available resources. She says, going forward, GVB will not have the same federal funding available. That change prompted us to proactively seek legislative clarity regarding GVB's ability to continue using LTAs with GVB resources. So here's the thing about the legislature's power. The legislature has plenary authority over the purse strings of the government of Guam, meaning they can regulate, they prescribe how much money every agency is able to spend, first of all. Secondly, they can regulate how that money is spent so long as they do not encroach upon the executive branch's discretionary powers. This is about the separation of powers, right, between the branches of the government. One of the things they can absolutely do is tell an agency, you cannot hire LTAs. And so the legislature has an ongoing restriction on this, except if you have an exemption. And it doesn't matter what the funding source is. If the legislature says you can't do this, then you can't do that. And the legislature has told GVB that, and GVB went ahead and they did that. And now they're saying, because we're going to need to switch from federal to local funding, we need you guys to extend the authorization to us. But how did you have the authorization to hire in the first place if the legislature specifically has said no? And who at GVB and on the board signed off certifying the availability of those funds, understanding that those funds were not available because they were not authorized? That's a felony. The senator, he responded to GVB and he says, your response confirms the central point raised in my original letter. GVB's request to restore limited term appointment authority was inaccurate because the FY27 budget does not repeal a GVB specific exemption contained in the FY26 budget. GVB is now advancing a different position, that the executive branch hiring restriction does not apply to the Bureau and that GVB possesses independent authority under its personnel rules. Regine. Following the failed execution of the $10 million tourism incentive program authorized by the legislature at GVB's request, and now this latest confusion concerning GVB's personnel authority, you have lost credibility in my eyes. When GVB asks the legislature to act, the Bureau must present an accurate, thoroughly reviewed request supported by the applicable law, its governing documents, and clearly defined intended outcomes. Additionally, because of the ongoing litigation, I am refraining from discussing these matters with you outside a public setting. If you do not wish to participate in legislative oversight hearings, I am willing to consider other public settings that comply fully with Guam's open government law. I will not, however, engage in private discussions regarding matters that should be addressed openly and placed on the public record. Good for you, Lujan. If the GVB Board of Directors supports the legal theory and legislative request presented in your response, the board should adopt a formal resolution requesting the proposed legislation as the governing boards of the GWA and GPA customarily do when seeking the introduction of legislation. A formal resolution would ensure that the request has been reviewed and approved by the board, that its factual and legal premises are accurate, and that the intended outcomes are clearly stated and documented. Your response also does not by itself establish that GVB's 16 current limited term appointments were validly authorized. Operational necessity may explain why GVB wants to retain these employees, but operational necessity is not a substitute for legal authority. Accordingly, please provide the following. I will have all of this stuff in a news article for all of you. I feel like the candidates for Attorney General should be actively discussing these matters, because something needs to be said about, so moving forward, right? In the moving forward of things, in our desire for justice, in our desire for clean government, in our desire to rid ourselves of endemic corruption, we want our leaders to act ethically, to do things the right way, to be transparent, to be accountable, and to be held accountable according to a process moving forward, right? And that's wonderful. But there also needs to be redemption. And I would even posit that in order for us to move forward, redemption has to come with that. We have to know that people are being held accountable for the wrong things that have been done. That's why I think it's very important between now and whenever the statutes of limits expire, we have active investigations auditing by the Office of Public Accountability that translates into investigations by the Office of the Attorney General, the Government Corruption Division, that translates into, if warranted and if there's sufficient evidence that crimes were committed, prosecutions of public corruption. And this is one of those things where it takes a village, right? It's not just the OPA and it's not just the media. It's also citizens coming forward and not just being anonymous sources, but also coming forward with courage and using their names and saying, hey, I saw this, or I know that this happened, and saying this to the media, or saying this to the Attorney General's office, saying this to the OPA, so that we can get somewhere. There can be redemption. As for now, we are going to do our duty as part of the media to expose as much as we can, and not just from now until when this administration leaves, but in exposing as much as we can about what this administration has done for as long as it takes, for as long as we have not expired in our demand for redemption. For Kandit News, I'm Troy Torres. You all have a beautiful day. God bless you.